Thank you to everybody for joining us today. We're excited to see so many people who have signed on and registered for tonight's program on acknowledging racism and building a path forward. The county executive, George Latimer, is here with us today, and he's going to provide opening remarks for our program. And I'm going to let him take it away now, and so we can start our program. County executive. County executive, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, very good. We'll take it from the top. It's a pleasure to be with you here. There's always a little bit of humor when we're dealing with 21st century technology in the age of COVID, but be here to bring very general opening comments as we get ready to have this dynamic panel discussion. We're very fortunate that we have the likes of Andrea Stewart-Cousins, the New York State Senate Majority Leader, with us, the Mayor of the City of Mount Vernon, Shawn Patterson Howard. We have with us Greenburgh Town Councilman Ken Jones, who is also an important lawyer defending the rights of individuals through Legal Aid Society, and civil rights attorney Mayo Bartlett, who amongst many things is working with our Human Rights Commission and is now co-chair with Leroy Frazier of our Police Reform and Reinvention Commission. It was 22 years ago or thereabouts, one floor below where I'm sitting here on the 9th floor of the county office building, when Andrea Stewart-Cousins, who is with us tonight, and Lois Bronze, who is no longer with us, had the vision and the drive to create a Human Rights Commission for Westchester County. And I was there with them as they took an idea and turned it into a reality. And I believe, certainly Andrea, who is a key speaker tonight and a key leader in the state of New York, and Lois Bronze, who is in our hearts every single day, would look for tonight's event as an example of what they envisioned 22 years ago as being a critical element of what the Human Rights Commission does, to bring up topics that must be discussed, which for some may be uncomfortable, and for all of us offer us a very difficult road ahead, but a necessary road. But to do that in the context of us advancing the rights of all human beings, that it is not acceptable for any of us to suffer discrimination, in this case racism, anti-Semitism, bias against the LGBT community, bias against people because they are young or because they are old, because they are physically or mentally in any way, shape, or form developmentally disabled, all the different categories by which we subdivide humans when in fact we are all part of one single human race. Tonight's topic of acknowledging racism and then identifying a path forward gives us two very different responsibilities that are tied together, and they are tied together. The path forward is something that almost always happens for those of us who are involved in government. We sit down all day, we have meetings, we make plans. What are we going to do about this problem? What are we going to do with that? What's the path forward? What's the path forward? What are the particular items that we must accomplish in order to reach a certain point? And every other element of discussion is almost irrelevant if we don't follow up with a path forward. That path forward is what happens when this conversation is over in an hour and a half, but it's what happens for the rest of our days to follow. How do we take this moment and use it to make the changes that are necessary? But you can't have a path forward until you look honestly and acknowledge racism as well as everything else. It's very difficult for all of us to admit failure or to admit weakness or to admit something about ourselves and our lives that aren't ideal. All of us have different issues. I struggle with a weight problem. It's my fault. It's nobody else's fault. It's a matter of self-control and discipline. I might have those disciplines in some things. I don't particularly have it in that area. But we can't move forward as a society unless we acknowledge the racism that exists in the society. It's not something from the history books. It's not what happened that ended with the Emancipation Proclamation. It's not something that was ended in the mid-1960s when we passed legislation, legitimate legislation on civil rights. It didn't end the first time we saw a black corporate executive or a black military general or the first black president of the United States. Those things did not end racism. Racism is something that is with us in this society at all times. We have to be honest. We have to acknowledge it. It exists, and how do we deal with it, and how do we have a path forward? If we ignore it, if we minimize it, if we say this is something that that other person responds to, or it's something in our history, and we don't realize it's with us today, then we're never really going to truly address it in an intelligent fashion. Our speakers tonight have lived the reality of being African American in this society. Every one of them has succeeded in their chosen area of profession. But the mountain is a steeper mountain to climb if you are black in this society. It is absolutely true that racism affects your ability to succeed. And for those who do succeed and overcome those obstacles, there are many more for whom those obstacles become impossible for them to enjoy the same American dream. And sitting here as a white man, understanding that certain things were provided to me, certain things I had to strive for, doesn't change the fact that other people face this racism every single day. When somebody looked at them, they couldn't tell if they were Catholic or Protestant or Jewish. They couldn't look at them and tell them if they were gay or straight. But they could immediately look at them and know that they were African American as opposed to being white. And that from small things to large things, that judgment would color every single thing of their life and their career and the way they interact with people. So those of us of goodwill, those of us in the white community that have not lived through the oppressive hand of racism, this is our moment to listen, to learn, to be allies to the voices of black leadership that need for us to move forward in a way that we haven't moved forward before. This day of reckoning, maybe it began on that street in Minneapolis, but it also began with a home that was invaded in Louisville, Kentucky, and it was on the streets of so many other places where we saw injustice in clear delineation. Let this be a moment that we now use, that we use to acknowledge the racism that does exist in the society, to do it without particular rancor, to recognize that it exists, and to have a path forward. And if there were any 4 friends of mine in this county that I would ask to comment on that, this panel that Tajesh Shala and his team have put together are people that can help us with both the acknowledgement and the path forward. And as one individual, I look forward to working with them and with you to make sure that Westchester County does everything we can to be the best possible role model of change and of progress. And with that, thank you for letting me share my thoughts, and I look forward to the conversations of our panel.
Thank you, George. For those who may not know me, my name is Tejas Sinchala. I'm the Executive Director for the Westchester County Human Rights Commission. My pronouns are he, him. It's good to see so many friends, old and new, joining us tonight. We had over 275 people register for tonight's program. Welcome, everyone. Some housekeeping issues. If anyone has any technology issues beyond what we've already had, please contact Copper Crane at email ccrane@westchestergov.com. His email address was included in the reminder email you received earlier today. I feel like I will owe him a big steak dinner after tonight. Thank you, Copper. During the registration period, we received emails with your questions. We invite you tonight to submit questions in the chat. We're trying to make the event as interactive as possible, although it's a virtual event. The chat feature will be visible to the commission's team members only. And for those who find it helpful, we have 2 sign languages interpreters assisting us this evening, Lorraine Gold and Jody Prysock. Thank you. The commission is celebrating its 20th year serving the public. The commission's mission is to educate about and enforce about the Westchester County Human Rights Law and the Westchester County Fair Housing Law. The commission accepts and investigates complaints of discrimination in employment, housing, public accommodations, and credit lending. Please contact us if you experience or witness discrimination in Westchester County. We want to hear from you. After tonight's program, we'll be adding in some resources on the commission's Facebook page. Please follow our Facebook page to learn about future events, resources, and news. This is the commission's kickoff conversation on race. This is the first in a series of conversations of how discrimination in all its forms harms our community. Tonight, we are focusing on anti-Black racism, which is not to say it is the only ism. Indeed, during COVID-19, we've seen anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Asian, anti-Latinx discrimination. Further conversations will address the effects of discrimination that occur in other communities. But tonight, we focus with intention on how deeply and profoundly anti-Black racism has harmed and continues to harm the Black community, but not just the Black community, but all of us. I remember in 2008, Mitch McConnell and some people said, America's entered a post-racial period because Barack Obama was elected president. Clearly, that was not and is not true. For many, it is becoming painfully obvious now as the nation is going through a reckoning on race. We're at a pivotal moment, and we're in the midst of one of the biggest racial movements in our country's modern history. People are demanding change, and we're here to listen. Racism is a cancer in our country. People are now starting to see how deeply racism has infected almost every aspect and institution of our nation, from how the criminal justice system operates, to how our neighborhoods were designed, and to the disparities in employment and our educational systems. People are starting to recognize when authority figures and others use racial microaggressions, dog whistles, gaslighting, and act on their implicit biases. People may not have even heard of those terms a few years ago, but they're becoming known in the lexicon now. Hardly a day goes by without an incident of racial discrimination being captured on video for the nation to see. The county executive talked about the first step in getting rid of this cancer is acknowledging racism and its presence today and in our nation's history. Only then can we work to address it. Like eradicating any cancer, it won't simply go away on its own, and it won't go away overnight. Working to eliminate will require a lifelong commitment from each of us. We must self-reflect, hear each other, and learn to become better. We have an opportunity now to have discussions we should have had a long time ago, quite frankly, about racial justice and equity. I firmly believe it's never too late to become educated and become better. Tonight, we are taking a step towards doing just that. Our conversation tonight might get uncomfortable at times. That's okay. We're here to listen and learn from our all-star panel. They'll talk about their personal experiences with race and how it impacted them. The panel will talk about how we got here, what this moment means, and where we as a community can go from here. The speakers' bios were sent earlier today, and for those who did not receive it, they'll be shared again tomorrow. All four panelists have impressive backgrounds. It's my pleasure to briefly introduce them to you. Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins' life and story has been one of firsts and overcoming barriers. In 2012, she became the first woman and the first African-American woman to lead a New York State legislative conference. In 2019, Senator Stewart-Cousins shattered the glass ceiling when she was elected temporary president and majority leader of the state Senate. In her first year, the Senate Majority Leader, Senator Stewart-Cousins, led one of the most productive sessions in state history. And on the heels of that productivity, I'm sure she has some things to share with us about what they've been up to this year. As the CE mentioned in his opening remarks, then County Legislator Stewart-Cousins in 2000 was instrumental in the commission's creation, and she's always been a champion of our office, and we appreciate that. Similarly, our second panelist, Mayor Shawn Patterson Howard, is a trailblazer. In 2019, she was elected as not only the first female mayor in the city of Mount Vernon's history, but also as the first woman of color elected mayor anywhere in Westchester County. Prior to that, she did groundbreaking work in the not-for-profit and government sectors for 25 years. Her favorite African proverb seems quite apropos for tonight's discussion. When spider webs unite, we can tie up a lion. Our third panelist is Ken Jones. Ken is a three-time elected councilman for the town of Greenburgh. He's a senior associate counsel at the Legal Aid Society. He also serves as an administrative law judge for the Human Rights Commission. He is a recipient of the Thurgood Marshall Award from the Black Democrats of Westchester for his dedication to civil rights, community activism, and devotion to equal justice for all. Our last panel, last but not least, is my friend Mayo Bartlett. He is a highly regarded and well-known civil rights attorney. He is the former chief of the Bias Crimes Unit at the Westchester County District Attorney's Office. He previously served as chair of the Human Rights Commission Board. We actually sat on the board together for 6 years. He's now a consultant to the Commission on Hate Incidents. He has sat on many boards with the aim of bettering our community. Most recently, he was named co-chair of the county's Police Reform and Reimagining Task Force. After the panel discussion is completed, we will have a Q&A period, which at this point I think will go beyond 7:30. Reverend Dr. Stephen Pogue, who's the vice chair of the commission, will provide closing remarks. Finally, I just want to note, while we're fighting a public health crisis, we're also fighting a pandemic of racism. And while there's optimism about finding a vaccine for coronavirus, we're not going to discover a vaccine for racism. That will be up to all of us. We all have a responsibility to come together, to keep having these difficult conversations so we can heal and grow. With that, I turn your attention to State Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
We can hear you perfect.
Okay, perfect. It's so good to be here this evening, and thank you for your leadership. Thank you for this conversation. I am really happy to be here with my good friends, all of them, the mayor, Shawn Howard. In fact, we were just on a panel a couple of nights ago, and Mayo Bartlett, who, again, known for years in this struggle, as well as my good friend Ken Jones, who's also my colleague in government in Greenberg as well. And of course, it's always good to see George Latimer, the county executive. Because of my technical difficulties, I missed his opening remarks, but I am sure that at some point he spoke about, the Human Rights Commission, Westchester's Human Rights Commission, and when I introduced the idea for the commission, I knew why it was necessary, because as a Black woman who has gone through a history of racism and seen it in so many ways, I knew why it was necessary. But certainly with Lois Bronze and George Latimer, certainly George is an ally when he was the county board chair at that time, really helped to make it possible. But because it was so hard to actually have it happen, I never envisioned 20 years down the road that this Human Rights Commission would be functioning in such a great way, because this is that moment. This is the moment where everything that you all have prepared to do, this is the moment where all of that hard work that has been rooted in our understanding that equality and justice has to be for all. The Human Rights Commission in Westchester County is prepared with great leadership and advisors and stewardship on the county executive level. So I am so thrilled. Just briefly, because we talked about it, when I'm the majority leader now, but I always tell people, when I was growing up, I had no aspirations to be in government. I knew nobody who looked like me. There was no people of color almost that were, elected to anything, certainly not women. So being a senator, being the leader of the Senate, that was nowhere. I mean, our limitations were clear. As women, you could be maybe a nurse, maybe a teacher. As a Black woman, maybe not. My mother typed 100 words a minute, and because at the time corporations did not hire Black people to do that kind of work, she was unable to get a job in corporate America. My dad was a World War II veteran, Purple Heart, Bronze Star. When he came home from the segregated army, he went back to a segregated America that had a GI Bill that did not pertain to him. So when white GIs were given opportunities for ownership and other things, Black GIs were not given any of those things. And when we look at the disparity in terms of wealth accumulation, even today, we see at its birthplace the discriminatory practices of our own federal government as it related to GI bills, as it related to housing opportunities, as it related to so many things. So when the government offered my father a public housing, we grew up in public housing, and we took advantage of public schools. But again, as I can tell you, my life growing up was limited because the options that my parents had were limited. Nonetheless, they were people of faith, people who valued education and one another. And my parents didn't spend a lot of time explaining to me I was Black, so therefore I couldn't do that or this. Society had a great role in explaining and defining for me what I could and couldn't do. I think for me, when I got into Yonkers as an adult, I moved to Yonkers and it's hit us in the face because we moved to Yonkers in 1979, and in the 80s, it turned out that the NAACP and others sued the city of Yonkers for segregation. And in the early 90s, Yonkers was found guilty of intentionally segregating its housing. East side was white. If you were Black, brown, poor, it was Southwest Yonkers, period. The other three quarters were practically out of bound, and it was systemic. And so when I got, here and we'd settled down, I thought that this was that kind of idyllic community, only to find out there was a fight to be had. I joined that fight with so many of my neighbors, and ultimately backed the one of three candidates who was willing to actually follow a desegregation order. This is in the 90s, this is in New York, and we backed that candidate. It was that candidate after he won that invited me into government. And when I got into government, I realized again the power of a government that segregated, the power of a government that gave you public housing, power of a government that gave you public education while it told you you couldn't be in corporations, where you could live, what you could learn. I realized the power of government, and I thought it would be a good use of my time to try and use the power of government to tear down barriers. And that's what I've done, and I continue to do. From there to even most recently, and I'll pass the baton on, but just recently in the wake of the pandemic of racism that we've seen, because I was in the position to lead in the Senate, we were able to pass 10 very important laws that dealt with police misconduct, whether it's now giving disciplinary records to people, whether it was banning chokeholds, which we did, setting up a special prosecutor's office, which we did, a special investigative force within the Attorney General, banning the Amy Cooper calls, and making sure that state police have body cameras. We did this on a leadership level. Both my colleague in the Assembly, Speaker Hasty, who's also an African American, and myself, we were there, and the first legislature in the country to answer the call for police accountability in the nation because of our experiences and because of our allies. People are now understanding in ways they hadn't understood before what the impacts of racism are, how they affect every single part of our lives, and what we can all do to stop it. So thank you for the conversation. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Majority Leader. We're gonna go to our next panelist, and that is going to be Ken Jones. Ken, we cannot hear you. You're still on mute.
Thank you, Tejas. Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
I'd like to thank you and the commission for convening this conversation. It's certainly an important conversation and one that has been on the back burner for too long. One of the biggest problems that we have as a culture in the United States is that of acknowledging racism. It's perhaps the most traumatic topic for many of us, both Blacks and whites, to discuss. Blacks in particular, because it's our shared negative experience, like an albatross around our necks, weighing us down. But we, as African Americans, endure it because to speak about it, to to white people is often to be challenged about racism's very existence, as if we're making it up, playing the race card. This is the same, I believe, that this is the same white denial that allowed white people to keep Black people as slaves to begin with, to dehumanize us so we could be owned, bought, bred, and sold. This white denial is very powerful stuff. So powerful that many of us, Black people, believe aspects of it too. I like to call that the mark of the oppressor showing itself upon the oppressed. Racism is a social construct created to justify human bondage, and social engineering is and was necessary to perpetuate it. An example of social engineering is not teaching actual racial history in public schools. This creates a deficit amongst the students, all of the students in integrated schools. They're being unaware of history. Children become more susceptible to the belief that after the Civil War, all Black people got 40 acres and a mule and everything was good. Even 100 years later, we got the right to vote. This enables white children to believe that all we as Black people need to do is pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. And we as Black people can feel guilty because we haven't done enough in the eyes of white people. This collective ignorance leads to uncomfortable silences when race is the topic, instead of intelligent, informed debate about the social engineering of our society. Slavery was based upon the valuation of Black lives. The better the worker, the more you were worth. But as soon as we stopped working for the master, we became worthless. And every time we gained something, it could be taken away from us by white people because there was no profit in it anymore for them. And there was no punishment for the white people because it didn't matter. That's why saying Black Lives Matter is important today. The idea of being worth less because Blacks are free has really created a palpable cognitive dissonance in the lives of Black people. I experience it every day. I'm sure many others of us experience it every day. How is it that we can go to work every day, we can put food on the table for our kids, and still be viewed in the eyes of some as less just because of the color of our skin? It's a conundrum, and one that we wrestle with. What I'd like to do is give you all a bit of an overview of the history that I didn't learn in public school because it's not taught in public school. First, the Civil War ended. That was a wonderful thing, obviously. We became free. We were allowed to chart our own destinies. What happened thereafter was the period called Reconstruction. During Reconstruction, roughly from 1863 to 1877, more African Americans were elected to Congress than in any other period, including the present time. It was a period of tremendous growth throughout the Black community. There was a lot of laws passed initially that benefited the newly freed slave. But then, as we've seen with the election of Barack Obama and the subsequent election of Donald Trump, there was backlash. We had been slaves for so long that it appears white people could not take it. So even though we were initially elected to office and given 40 acres and a mule, within 14 years, Jim Crow and vagrancy laws began to be passed, basically criminalizing poverty. African Americans were arrested because they were on the street after sundown. They were arrested because they didn't have a job. They were arrested because they looked in the direction of a white woman while walking down the street. This is the beginning of the criminalization of poverty in the United States. And this led to convict leasing and prison labor. The more people who were arrested for being poor, for being on the street after sundown, for daring to look a white man in the eye, the more the prisons filled up. And that gave someone the idea to lease inmates out to do the same work that the slaves did before they were freed. This also led to sharecropping, where African-American farmers who could not get jobs because no one would hire them were basically leased back to the same plantations that they had been freed from. Not paid much, expected to work long hours, and really be stuck on the farm because the laws were such that we weren't allowed to walk around in town after dark. Now, I didn't learn about any of this in school. I don't know whether you did either. But it's so important that we remember these things because these are the things that ingrained racism into the fabric of society, the society that we all live in, that we've grown up in, that we still live in. Now, shortly after World War I, when soldiers began to come home, African-American soldiers began to come home, they moved into segregated communities because the rule at that time was separate but equal. And they didn't mind living in those communities. In fact, a lot of people, Black people, felt better in those communities than they did in the larger, whiter communities because they could be themselves. They could let their hair down. They could go out after dark. They could run a business and become successful, put food on the tables for their families, live middle class and upper middle class lives without fear of white repercussion. But what ended up happening was it was too much for a lot of the neighboring white communities to bear. So we saw a rash of really serious riots in which these prosperous, segregated, middle-class Black communities were burned to the ground by white mobs. Hundreds of African Americans died just for living in their own segregated communities because those communities became prosperous and the white people couldn't take it. So they took it away. They took it away. They burned it to the ground. Tulsa, Oklahoma has been in the news lately. But it wasn't the only community, prosperous African American community, that was burned to the ground at that time. The period between World War I and World War II saw incredible numbers of prosperous African American communities burned to the ground, including Rosewood, Florida, and East St. Louis, Illinois. Then we come to the period of World War II. African Americans fought side by side white Americans in World War II. They had an expectation that because they fought in the war, they would come back home and things would be different. Well, as Majority Leader Cousins described for us earlier, that wasn't the case. Successful African American soldiers who had been successful in the war came home to find the same hostile, segregated communities that they had left. In fact, one of the most egregious and horrifying aspects of returning World War II veterans that I learned about, not in school, but through my parents and relatives, my father in particular, was that African American men were lynched because they were wearing their uniforms. It was too much for some whites to believe that African American men could fight beside them in the war and come home and be proud of the fact that they had done that. More African American soldiers wearing World War II uniforms were lynched during that period than any other period in the United States history. The lynchings continued, but that period is especially egregious. We then get to the 50s. And the 50s in America were incredibly trying times for African Americans. Some of us were college educated, and we're looking for a brighter America. But what we found was, even though we were college educated, it didn't matter. We still couldn't get hired. Separate but equal was still the rule until the 1954 decision in Brown versus Board of Education. But what that did, while illuminating the discrimination within the school districts and ending separate but equal, it really worked to destroy what had become in segregated Black communities relatively successful school districts. Schools that were in Black communities all of a sudden had to be integrated. Students had to leave. Schools were closed down in Black communities so white kids could be bused, so Black kids could be bused to white communities that didn't want them. So again, there's that conundrum of giving to us with one hand and taking away with the other. Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan persisted through the civil rights marches of the 60s. And what we saw there was not only the burning of our communities, but the killing of our leaders. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X were killed in cold blood simply because they were advocating that Black lives mattered. Again, this is why it's important today that we say Black lives matter, because for so long they haven't. For so long, when we strived to make a difference, we were killed and our communities were burned to the ground. Now, one of the most insidious forms of racism that exists today that began then, vestiges of it exist today, is redlining, the practice of drawing on maps, drawing a red line around African American neighborhoods so realtors would know not to advertise homes for whites there. They would know to only steer Blacks into those neighborhoods. So banks would know not to give loans to people who wanted to buy homes in those neighborhoods. Or so banks would know that they needed to give, the types of loans with balloon payments and high interest rates that African Americans can barely afford. Those were the types of loans that they would give to Black people to move into these neighborhoods. And once they got into these neighborhoods, they knew, the banks, that the Black people couldn't afford to be there. So very often it was difficult for them to keep up with their payments. And when they couldn't keep up with their payments, those same banks went in and took those houses back after making those loans at incredibly high interest rates that they knew the people couldn't afford. It's really unbelievable what happened in those neighborhoods. Once they got us into those neighborhoods, surrounded by those red lines, the municipalities then began to roll back services to those neighborhoods. So, of course, what happens is there are a lot of foreclosures because the banks made phony loans and they're taking the property back. The municipality stops collecting the garbage. They stop shoveling the snow. They stop, giving the same municipal services in those communities that they gave in the white communities. So the neighborhoods begin to deteriorate. And that just fed this whole notion that Black people are lazy and slovenly and like to live in filth and don't take care of themselves and their neighborhoods. This is the perpetuation of that myth, when really it was all about social engineering, what was done to us rather than what we were doing to ourselves. That brings us to the more recent phenomenon of the anti-drug efforts in the 1980s. The 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act criminalized drug use in America. Because of that act, convictions led to mandatory minimum sentences, mandatory evictions, and the elimination of government benefits for people who had been convicted. What this did was criminalize poverty and make it a cycle that repeated itself. And because of the poverty in the Black community, the drug use in the Black community, when African Americans began to get arrested for the same offenses that white Americans would commit, they ended up, during the crack epidemic, getting stiffer sentences with more harsher consequences, which made an already depleted African American population even more depleted. And it just served to reinforce the criminalization of poverty in the United States, which was the effects of which were felt much more severely in the African American community. This is the history, part of the history, that many of us don't want to acknowledge or discuss. It's a negative history of social engineering that we as Black people don't want to highlight. And white people don't want to highlight it either. So we're mostly stuck in a politically correct silence or an ignorant silence. And to move forward, we've got to break this silence, acknowledge the racism and how each of us, no matter what race, has been affected by it. Now, I was born in 1966, and I'm truly blessed for my mother and father, who I now know must have been shielding me from racism daily because I was not conscious of it. My father's family was in New Rochelle since 1900. New Rochelle was the scene of the first court-ordered school desegregation case in the North when the United States Supreme Court decided in 1962 that its Lincoln school boundaries had been intentionally drawn to create segregated elementary school districts. Lincoln School, which was in a solid middle-class Black neighborhood where my family lived, was closed and demolished in 1965. And the students of that district, including myself, were bused to school districts in white neighborhoods. And I didn't learn about this until my first year in law school when I was 25 years old. That's when I realized that my idyllic childhood was socially engineered by white people I was totally unaware of. Now, one short story from the past, and then one from the future. One from the present. I know my time is running out. When my aunt and uncle moved to Hartsdale in unincorporated Greenberg in 1947, the redlining was so bad that they had to have a Jewish couple purchase the home that they moved into for them. When they moved into the home, the white neighbors came to them and offered to buy the home from them. When my aunt and uncle wouldn't sell them the home, they burned a cross on their front yard. That was in 1947. Recently, in municipal government, I have observed what I believe to be white male patriarchy or unintentional racial bias in full effect, with negotiations between the Greenberg Housing Authority and the Town of Greenberg Town Board. I watched as an independent decision-making authority with a board of commissioners and a chair who are all Black people appointed by the town board was micromanaged like no other similarly situated independent decision-making board in the town. And to me and members of the Housing Authority Board, it seemed like racial bias was at play. And most recently, in the summer of 2019, again in New Rochelle, New York, I was called nigger while crossing the street out of nowhere from a white guy in a pickup truck who was just driving by me in my suit and tie on the street. These are uncomfortable incidents that should spur uncomfortable conversations that will hopefully lead us into a better place around racism in our culture and society. Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thank you for those emotional words. Very powerful, Ken. Our next speaker is Mayor Shawn Patterson Howard.
Good evening, everyone. So tonight I'm going to just share a little bit on how I've experienced personal racism, but I've also been asked to speak about allies and how to be a good ally and what being a not so good ally looks like. Being born in 1968 in Mount Vernon, which was a very diverse community at that time, I actually enjoyed the privilege of growing up with what didn't feel like a lot of racism. I went to very diverse schools, public schools here in Mount Vernon. I went straight through the public school system. I went to school with, Italians, Irish, Jewish community, Asian students, Black, white, Spanish, and it felt like a fairy tale. What I didn't always recognize until I got to 10th grade is that I went throughout my entire education, all the way until 10th grade, without ever experiencing a Black male teacher. And the first time that I experienced having a Black male teacher, it was Dr. Larry Spruill, and he taught African American history in Mount Vernon High School. And he really sat us down and gave us an opportunity to understand our Blackness, and even just go and look at some of the phrases and terms that were used, and why were we referring to ourselves as Blacks and not African Americans. My grandfather was the historian in my family, and being the first African American or person of color to ever work in Mount Vernon City Hall, and being born in 1905, clearly he had experienced a great deal of racism, and he shared that with me. And I think, our families always tried to protect us from that. We were always taught to sit up straight, to speak well, to make sure that we were articulate. We were taught how to move and operate and to be. And it was very interesting, because I think oftentimes we were being taught as young people how to be white, how to be accepted by white people, how to be respected by white people, how to not be threatening to white people. And that's what a lot of that was about. And so when I got to 10th grade and I had Dr. Spruill, and he helped us understand, just some of the terminology. Why aren't you calling yourself an African American or an African in America? And he really took us back and not just taught us American history, but African history. I had an opportunity to see myself in a new light. And in 11th grade, I had the opportunity to go with Dr. Spruill and several of my classmates from Mount Vernon High School and New Rochelle High School over to Senegal, West Africa, the Gambia, and the Ivory Coast. And this was a 2-week trip that we had an opportunity to take as students. And it just opened my eyes up. We didn't just go on the trip, but we sat in the Akbar for several months, and we learned about African culture and African history and African traditions and norms. And we learned how to be respectful Americans and not go over there with the ignorance, and understand that Africa was very industrialized, had communities and professions. And it was more than, I grew up watching Tarzan. So we needed to understand that Africa was much more than what we saw on TV. It was much more than UNICEF. It wasn't just poor children and poor people, that Africa had rich industry and was full of resources, but had been misused for so long. And it really helped me to understand who I was, and to come into my own as a African American and as a woman of color. I, after that, was determined that I would attend a predominantly, a historically Black college and university. And I made the decision to attend Howard University in Washington, D.C. And I think that was one of the best decisions I ever made. Now, please be clear, I've always known that I was Black. But when you actually have the opportunity to be taught more of your history, not just here in America, but the role of Black people and in the African diaspora, and how we've contributed around the world and in every country and on every continent, it's really, really an eye opener. And I think that really just shifted my life so much. I think the first time I had one of those big outwardly racial events, the type that kind of sends you into shock and jars you, is I came home to Mount Vernon after my freshman year at Howard, and I was standing in front of my apartment building, and a group of white gentlemen drove by and just started calling me nigga, nigga, nigga. And for me, that was, I was 18 or 19, and I couldn't believe it. I hadn't experienced that, in Mount Vernon. I hadn't experienced it during my freshman year in college. And I ran upstairs and I told my mother, and I think I wanted to call the police and tell them, you know, what happened. I couldn't believe that racism was showing its face in that very outward and vitriolic way in Mount Vernon. You know, clearly as I got a little bit older and experienced life more and started to move into my professional career, I think that's when I began to experience racism and microaggressions, and really be able to see it for what it was. You know, the comments like, oh, well, why did you choose to go to a Black college? Could you not get into Georgetown or GW? Oh, why would you choose to continue to live on the South Side? I became mayor and, you know, and was sworn in now, and I still live on the South Side in Mount Vernon. And a lot of people ask me, well, when are you going to move? Aren't you going to move to Fleetwood or to the one of the better parts of the neighborhood? You still kind of live in the hood. And what is that all about? Because it's a neighborhood, and it's a neighborhood I'm comfortable with. And it's a safe neighborhood, and I don't have to move to the good side of town in order to make people feel comfortable. I'm living in a community, and in a neighborhood that's becoming more and more diverse as people invest in all segments of our community here in Mount Vernon. So I want to talk for a few minutes about how to be an ally and what is an ally. And an ally is someone who basically uses their privilege and comes from a privileged group, to help to elevate and amplify the concerns, and the issues that a marginalized group is experiencing. And so tonight we're really talking about Black lives and how Black lives matter. And so it can be, you know, a white person who comes in and, you know, shares and says, well, not even that I understand, because you can't say I understand because you really don't. You can say, I appreciate what you're going through. I want to learn more. How can I assist in advancing this conversation, in sounding the alarm, in increasing the urgency in which our community responds to police brutality, to racism, to structural racism, to separate and unequal, as we've heard, whether it's in our schools. It's not just about when someone is killed by the police. It's not just if someone is lynched. We have to stop being shocked that all of this is still happening in 2020. Yes, we had a Black president. And yes, we have an African-American woman who is our New York State Senate Majority Leader. And yes, we are seeing Black people who are leading corporations, but that does not mean that racism does not exist. I've been told many times, you know, look, you guys have to get over it. Stop being so sensitive. Stop pulling the race card. Stop taking what we're saying the wrong way. We really mean well. We're going to come out and help. Oh, look at all of the white people who are now marching and helping to push forward the case for George Floyd. You know, he was such a good man. And, you know, that's almost kind of like what we had to do many years ago in the civil rights era. They had to find the right Black person, the perfect Black person in Rosa Parks to make the case for bus desegregation and for her to be arrested. And so we've had many hashtags, dozens, hundreds of hashtags over the years. But, you know, with George Floyd and the glaring way in which it happened, and I think with people being home, experiencing COVID and being isolated, to have to sit there and watch it on TV over and over again on every public channel and every cable channel just finally hit the nerve of some people. We're so busy in our day-to-day lives that if society was open and people were going on about their regular business, I think a lot of people would have missed it. Just like they got upset about Trayvon Martin, or they were upset about Eric Garner. When people's lives went back to normal and they had an opportunity to continue to go about their daily business, they did. But for us as African Americans, this is something that we're dealing with every day. And so we don't forget the hashtags. We may not be able to march all the time because we have to work like everyone else, but this time and this season, it was a different. How else can you be an ally? You can lend your voice. You can lend your voice, but in lending your voice, understand that you're lending your voice to amplify our voices. not to change the narrative, not to hijack the narrative, not to take over the narrative, not just to express your outrage and your shock and your anger, and not because you're now trying to take this and make it your issue. That's one of the things that I've seen sometimes. And so being an ally, we're welcoming you into our space. We're welcoming you to become a part of the room, come to the table, but not always to lead the discussion, but to listen, to learn, to support, and to be activated, but not to take over the discussion. And I've seen some of that even happen here in Westchester. I've been invited to a lot of rallies, and they were led by white people, and I felt that was great and that's wonderful and I loved it. But they tried to include and bring in those people who had experienced structural racism and asked them to lend their voices, but they didn't take it over. But then I've seen some other examples and some news coverage of people setting up little tent cities and saying, well, we're here because we need to make sure that the Black people are protected. We need to make sure that the Black people have fair housing. We need to make sure that the homeless are taken care of. And, you know, when it's just you and you don't see a representation of the oppressed people and the oppressed community, then are you still being an ally, or is this performance justice? Are you looking to be a support? Are you looking to be a friend? Are you looking to be awarded? Are you looking to be praised? Are you looking to be a rescuer, a white hero? Because a lot of people have the hero syndrome, and we've seen it over and over again in movies and in stories. Oh, look, I went to Africa and I fed the children. Oh, look what I did. I'm helping these poor Black people. Oh, look, I'm taking care of people who are returning home from prison. Oh, look, I'm marching, and I've been marching, and oh my goodness, I've been arrested. So clearly I am an ally. Clearly I am down for the cause. Clearly I have credibility with Black people. You know, that's all performance allyship. That's not genuine allyship. There are some times that you will get compliments, but oftentimes what you do, you also do in private. Are you just calling out racism in other states and injustice in other states? If you're really an ally, then we need you to stand tall with us, even as we deal with racism and police brutality here in Westchester. We don't need you to just talk about George Floyd or Tamir Rice or Eric Garner. It's easy to talk about Breonna Taylor and what's happening in Louisville, Kentucky. But can you stand and have a conversation about the racism and the structural racism, the discrimination, and the separate but unequal practices that still exist in our own county? And that's really, really important. Oftentimes we'll march and we'll rally and we'll go down to Manhattan and we'll lift our voice and we'll post social media statuses about things that are happening very far away. But it's really interesting when I look at some of those same people who won't speak up when they see it here. They won't call a thing because they might know those electeds that oversee those cities. They might have friends in those police departments, and they don't want to stir the pot locally because it might cost you something. Well, I'm going to say, as an African American woman, it costs me every day. And so I don't get to step away from the conversation. I don't get to step away from the table. I don't get to step away from the reality of what we experience here on a daily basis. We don't have that. We don't have that luxury. And so if you can only be a social justice warrior for things that are happening far across the country, but you can't stand and speak truth to power for things that you are seeing here, if you can't call it on your job when you see it, we're not asking you to be radical. We're not asking you to be outraged, but we have to be willing to have crucial and critical conversations that lead to constructive results. It's not about just screaming. It's not just about talking about Black power. It's not just about marching and pumping your fists, but it's about being willing to have the very hard and the very tough conversations with even people that you know. When you're on your job, you say, you know, why is so-and-so not being promoted? They're doing incredible work. They're doing great things. what are our hiring practices here? These are things that we might have to look at. And it's not just to be symbolic. We don't want to just change the narrative. We want to change the systems that dictate how business is done in our local communities and across our state and across our nation. You want to make sure that you can, as an ally, that you can mentor other non-persons of color and teach them how to have the conversations and how to come to the table and how to be an ally and how to be a supporter. Be an upstander and not a bystander. Being an ally is not always a passive activity. And so saying you're not racist is one thing, but being anti-racist is another thing. So again, calling out practices and policies and behaviors that are racist, we have to be able to call it out. And then show up where it counts. Yes, you can show up at rallies, but we also need you to show up at the voting polls. We need you to get out there and make sure that our community's being counted in the census. We need you to show up at schools and see what type of curriculums are being taught, even if it's in a predominantly white district. Are the contributions of African Americans and other marginalized groups being taught to our children in our school districts? Not just during Black History Month, but Black history is 365 days a year. And so we have to make sure that while we're worrying about the curriculums in school and making sure that our children are passing standardized tests, that we're not using that as an excuse to not teach Black history as part of an American history. African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, we have fought in every major war that this country has experienced. And we are just as patriotic as any other group in this country. And I would even challenge you sometimes to say that we're more patriotic because we've fought in wars and our blood has been shed, but we have not always benefited from the wins and the gains that our white counterparts have experienced. We don't get to hide our Blackness because our skin color is different. And so it's not easy to blend in. And when you come to the table, listen for understanding and not just for action. Sometimes the best thing that you can do, whenever I go to a meeting and I'm in a new place, I sit at the table and I try and read the room. I try and get to know the people. I try to know the issue. Oh, goodness, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that was on, and not just take something over. That's very, very important that we look to understand and not just to be active and go out and march. And I want to say our county executive talked about finding a path forward. And we're hearing, we've heard about reparations. I heard this morning that there is a community in North Carolina that's looking for, to offer the 12% of the African Americans in their community possible reparations. And reparations is definitely a part of the conversation, but it's not the only conversation. We're not just looking for a handout. The conversations around buying Black, that was trending locally in the news about 2 weeks ago, that we had a blackout day and to please go and support Black businesses. Well, we want you to support Black businesses. It's great that some larger corporations are now saying that they're going to have 15% of their vendors be Black businesses. It's great that there are corporate entities that are saying, looking at their diversity and inclusion. But we have to understand that actions like that are not just the goal, it's part of a larger strategy where we're recognizing the contributions and where we're trying to increase opportunity and increase equity and parity. So if your corporation has decided that you're going to hire a diversity and inclusion person, that's great. But are we changing our hiring practices? Are we making sure our company is more reflective of the people that we're serving? And this is not reverse discrimination. You accept our money, so now pay us also for what we provide and what we do. And are we seeking to change the landscape of opportunity? That's very important. So if you're an ally, are we seeking to change the landscape of opportunity here, not just in our country, but in our county and in our local communities? It's very, very important. And I'm sorry if I'm looking down, but you know, when you talk sometimes, you forget what you wanted to say. So microaggressions is something that I was also asked to speak about. And some people ask, you know, what are microaggressions? And it's more than people just taking things sensitively. I've had people tell me, you know, are you mixed? You have to be mixed. You speak so well. Why do you speak so well? You're not like most Black people I know. And that's something, interestingly, that I heard for many years in the beginning of my career in human services. And I always found that to be such an interesting statement. And I said, well, what does that mean? How people of color do you associate with outside of work? Because you're working in a human service agency where you're dealing with people on welfare who are mentally ill or who are homeless or who are coming home from prison. If that's really the only exposure that you have to Black people is at work, where you're here to help, where everyone that you're working with has come to you because they have a deficit, then you really need to get out and meet some more Black people, because we're doctors and we're lawyers and we're engineers and we're hairdressers and we're entrepreneurs and we're so many different things, and we show up in so many different ways. We are a rainbow as Black people, as African Americans, or persons in the African diaspora. We're not a homogenous people. We agree with each other, and there are times that we disagree with each other. You have to understand that also socioeconomically, if we have parity, if our education is similar, if our finances are similar, if our upbringing is similar, that we might have more in common with people who are sometimes not, well, we have much more in common with people who are white than many think. Black people, whether they live in the ghetto, whether they live in the poor neighborhood, and I say ghetto because that's the term that people use, not my phrase, or whether we live in a upper middle class gated neighborhood, we all want the same thing. So regardless of whether you're on the south side, the north side, the east side, or the west side, we want to live in a safe neighborhood. We want our children to have better education and better opportunities than we ever had and we ever experienced. We all want to get home safely at night, and we all want a part of the American dream, and that's not unique. We want the same thing that everyone else wants. So we're not looking for privilege and we're not looking for handouts, but we are looking for an equal opportunity, and we're looking for equity. We're not looking to pull the race card, but we have no problem having the hard conversation, because sometimes the conversation has to do a lot with race. And I have to say this because I am a Black woman 365 days of the year, 24 hours a day. If I am upset about something, I have the right to be upset. And I don't want to always be referred to as the angry Black woman. I'm not an angry Black woman, but there are days that as a Black woman, I am angry. And there's a difference. I'm not bitter, but I do get frustrated about the racism, the ignorance, the arrogance, and sometimes the privilege that people enjoy so much that they can't see it. And so step back and say, before you say we're angry, before you say that we are entitled, step back and look at the privilege that you enjoy and that you've enjoyed for most of your life and you still enjoy today. And there's nothing wrong. Um, I don't think privilege is a terrible thing, but to not be able to acknowledge that you come from a privileged group is blinders. And the last thing I have to say, please don't say that you don't see color. Please don't. That's like saying that you don't see man, you don't see woman, you don't see nice neighborhoods, you don't see bad neighborhoods. You see me, and to ignore that I am a Black woman, or to say that, well, I don't see you as a Black woman, then that ignores a part of my dimension of diversity. I want you to see all of who I am. I don't want you to ignore any of who I am, because me being a Black woman, me being a minister, me being a public servant, that's all a part of who I am. Being a wife, a daughter, a mother, those are the dimensions of diversity that I bring to the table. And I want you to see me as a full person and not ignore a part of who I am. And so I'm just so glad that we're having this discussion. I look forward to more crucial, critical, and constructive conversations as we continue to lift and advance the discussion of race, class, privilege, and power in our community. Thank you, everyone, and I look forward to more discussion after our presenters. And I'm so proud to be on a panel with these incredible public servants. Senator Cousins is a mentor of mine, and Mayo and I have gotten to know each other more over the past few years, and I look forward to working with you. And Ken, I look forward to getting to know you more and having great opportunities to work with you, because there is work to be done. And thank you, as always, County Executive Latimer, for not being afraid to have the tough discussions. God bless everyone, and let's have a great dialogue after Mayo.
Thank you so much, Mayor. Mayo, I do not envy you having to follow the majority leader, the mayor, and town councilman. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Tejas, first, I would love to thank all of you and thank you, Tejas, for having the vision to have this panel so that we can have this discussion, which I believe is a tremendously necessary discussion, and the first of many that we intend to have focusing on different topics. I definitely want to thank Senator Stewart-Cousins for her wonderful words. Mayor Shawn Patterson Howard, thank you for your wonderful words as well. And my good friend Ken Jones for your lesson today. And I also want to thank our County Executive, George Latimer. And I'm thankful to have known George for almost 3 decades now. And what he says comes from the heart. So it's a pleasure and it's a privilege to work with all of you. And it's a tremendous amount of work to be done. I'm going to be a bit briefer in the interest of time, because I know we did get started a little bit later, and we're willing to go longer today. But we've talked and heard a lot about some of the things that exist in our local municipalities, in our workplace, and we've heard some tremendously moving stories. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, and I'm going to share a little bit about my personal history. But then I want to go into some things that will help to explain where we are, and we'll put the individual stories in context and look at some of the systemic challenges that we have, not only from the time that we initially came here in the 1600s, but today. And I want to discuss all of that. But briefly, I'll tell you that I am the son of a coal miner's daughter. My mother grew up in Keystone, West Virginia. She was in McDowell County. It's the southernmost county in West Virginia. It's in McDowell County. And McDowell County was known as the Free State of McDowell County. It was known as the Free State of McDowell County because in the early 1900s, it was the largest coal mining town in the world, produced more coal than anywhere else in the world. And as a result, it was a booming financial community. And it was called the Free State because they had a tremendous number of African Americans. And there's actually a documentary called The Mining Wars on PBS. And you can see that when the miners came out of the mine, it was difficult to tell what race a person was, because you're coming out of the belly of the earth and everybody was black, not black skin, not African American, but covered in coal. And they relied on each other in order to come back out of that mountain. So they had probably one of the highest percentages of elected Black officials at that time as well, which is another reason why they called themselves the Free State of McDowell County. My grandfather was a coal miner. My great uncle was a coal miner. Grandfather died in his early 50s when I was a little boy. My great uncle was maybe a little more lucky, and maybe not so much, because he died later in life from black lung and suffered tremendously. And right now we're talking about mining. We're talking about bringing back those jobs. And those are jobs, again, when we look at first responders, that nobody wants. So we talk about people being heroes. We like to use that terminology and we use it very loosely. But to go back to what Senator Cousins said, and also what Ken Jones talked about, you're really a hero. You're fighting for this country overseas. How is it that you end up being lynched when you come home wearing that same uniform? How is it that when you're fighting the opposition in another country, those people in that country tell you you should be fighting the United States because they're the ones who are oppressing you, not us? That the people in Vietnam are calling you their brother. And you come back home and you're told that you should pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you have to go move into a housing project or to go get a job, and to ignore all the trauma that you have as a result of having killed people and had people try to kill you overseas, sometimes for 2, 3, 4 tours. On my father's side, he grew up in Westchester County, and both of his parents were domestic. So they worked cleaning other people's homes and preparing their meals. And I remember on Thanksgiving waiting for them sometimes to come home because they had to cut the turkey for that other family first. Now, interestingly, they all valued, and my grandmother on my mother's side was a teacher. My grandfather had a college education, but he couldn't be a teacher because he didn't make any money as a teacher. He had to be a coal miner so the family would be economically viable. Now, my mother went to college. My father went to college. My father became an accountant. My mother was a chemist. She became a patent attorney later in life. But my father, as an accountant, could not get a job in a big 8 accounting firm because they weren't hiring. And again, I want us to think of how each of these things, although it may seem to be my individual story, how that impacts my family intergenerationally, how that impacts my community intergenerationally. So each of these systemic barriers means that as an IRS agent, he made less money than a person who worked at Arthur Andersen or at another big 8 accounting firm. He had fewer opportunities to move up and fewer networking opportunities, fewer ways for me and my sisters to be able to move forward. All of that adds up to money. All of that adds up to, as Senator Stewart-Cousins said, living in housing projects, you don't own that. So when you move out, you just move out. There's no equity. There's no appreciation. There's nothing to hand to your future generations. There's nothing to give your children. So they don't have the appreciation, the benefit of having that money when that property is sold. The other thing is that, look, my mother had to work as a patent agent. She was denied an opportunity to work into corporate America for quite a long time. So all of these things play a significant role in terms of how much wealth a community has. Now, look, even buying a home, many communities, even in Westchester County to this day, have restrictive covenants on the property. So the deed itself still says that it cannot be sold to a Black person. Now, we don't enforce that deed, but it's there. It's there. So when we start to say, well, racism is made up, it's something that people say who hate America, it's anything but that. And whatever your background is, imagine if you were Polish, that if you went to buy a home, somebody told you, we'd love to sell you this house, but we can't because the deed says no Polish can buy this house. No Irish can buy this house. No Italians can buy this house. And there certainly was discrimination against Irish, Italians, and Polish and others. And we will get into that in future conversations. We'll talk about that, about Irish need not apply, take your choice, things that happen to Asians in this country. But as we look at that, it just brings me back to the Star-Spangled Banner. And if you look at Colin Kaepernick, lots of people would say, well, why is he taking a knee? He had freedom. And in fact, his protest was co-opted and people took it away from him and started to define what his message was for him, took it out of his hands. And there are a number of messages, a number of reasons why people took a knee at football games, and why mayors and governors and other highly elected officials are now doing the same thing, why the NFL is now saying that it's all right, why NASCAR is now saying that the Confederate flag shouldn't be flown anymore. We're mostly familiar with the first verse of the Star-Spangled Banner, oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light. And it ends with, the Star-Spangled Banner still waves and it's the land of the free and the home of the brave. But that's not what was in the intent, in the heart of Francis Scott Key's when he wrote that. Okay, what was in his heart was something that was much more sinister. And if you go to the third verse, which, if we're going to sing the song, should be sung. And it says, and where is that band who so vauntingly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion, a home and a country should leave us no more? Their blood has washed out of their foul footsteps pollution. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or gloom of the grave. And the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph doth wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave. And consider Black people to be part of the free, part of the people who belong to this country. Well, they thought we belonged to this country, but to whom this country belonged. They didn't consider indentured servants the same manner that they considered everybody else. And I think that if we sang that song, it would be very difficult to find people who would want to sing that at the Super Bowl. And I don't think you'd get the same manner of applause. So sometimes we don't look at the history of the country. And as far as I'm concerned, we need to look at truth and reconciliation. And if you were to look at a country that is a tremendous example of how being honest and open and having honest conversations about your history has allowed that nation to thrive, it's South Africa. So coming out of the bondage of apartheid and coming out of having Nelson Mandela imprisoned for decades, they were able to say, we're going to have to still be one country, but we're going to have an honest, open conversation about our history. We've never done that in the United States. In fact, you can graduate from your school, including college. You could have a master's degree and not know the actual history of the United States. And it does us all a tremendous amount of harm. And quite often, my kids told me that, listen, they had to take the citizenship test. And many of the kids in their class didn't pass that test. So I thought it was ironic that in an age when we're talking about keeping people out of the United States, that the immigrants who are here were able to pass a test that many of us couldn't pass, that many of them knew more about the United States than we did. That's sad. And people elsewhere teach their children about the United States. They teach about the true history of the United States. There's a book, A People's History of the United States. But it's important to know that it wasn't that long ago that women couldn't vote. It's important to know that men couldn't vote, not just Black men or brown men or Asian men, but white men couldn't vote. You had to be a landowner, that the owners who we revere so much, and we get upset about their monuments, being the topic of discussion for whether it really stands for our ideals, didn't think enough of white men that weren't rich to allow them to vote. If you didn't own property, you couldn't vote. And nobody owned a condominium. Nobody had a quarter acre of land or an acre lot that we might think is nice today. Those people were not entrusted to vote. It was the wealthy landowners who owned maybe an entire village, an entire town, and they didn't think that they were bright enough to vote, so they still added the Electoral College to correct any mistakes they thought they may have had. So I think that when we ignore someone's plight, when we ignore and refuse to have a conversation, and when we characterize someone who is aggrieved as being un-American because they want to talk about their experience, we do a disservice not only to them, but we do a disservice to ourselves. And if you look at what our country is capable of being, it's really limitless. We have so much talent, so much capability, that when we finally do have our truth and our reconciliation, and we discuss the history of all people in this country and what they encountered. But again, going back to what County Executive Latimer said, that I could come here as a Polish person and my children may not have an accent. They can change their name. They can marry somebody who has a surname that's acceptable. If you are Black, brown, Asian, they can look at you and you are readily identifiable. So I'll tell you just a few anecdotes. One is something that I observed when I ran the bias crime unit, and that was after September 11th. There was a rumor that was going around that suggested that there was a gas station in New Rochelle, and that there were people there who were from Iraq. Now, at the time, nobody had any idea who was responsible for the World Trade Center attack, and as we now know, Iraq had nothing to do with it. But again, they said that these people were flying an Iraqi flag. And again, I don't know if they would know what the Iraqi flag looked like, but let's presume that they did, and that they were celebrating the towers coming down. And it's actually that led to people driving up to this gas station in New Rochelle and threatening the people that were there. And the people that were there were tan, they were brown skinned, but they weren't Iraqi. They were Arab. They weren't Muslim. And by the way, you can't look at someone and tell whether the person is Muslim, Christian, Jewish, or anything else, because those are faiths. It's not an ethnicity. But they happened to be Italian. They were Sicilian. And everybody that worked there was Sicilian. They had owned that gas station for many years. And they really came pretty close to getting really badly hurt or worse for no reason, based on someone's ignorance, based on someone's thought as to who they believe these people were, and based on a lie. So it's important that we look at those types of incidents. It's important that we look at a Kenneth Chamberlain Sr. and look at the fact that, Mr. Chamberlain triggers his life aid alert and that he does so by mistake. But when the police arrive and ask him if he's okay, he says he is, but it's not enough. That it then goes into a 90-minute standoff where they demand to come into his house, and that on audio tape and videotape, you can hear them cursing at him and taunting him. And when he says, as a 68-year-old man, I'm a 68-year-old man with a heart condition, please just leave me alone, that at least one of the officers felt it was all right to say, we don't give an F, and call him the N-word. And we know that because that's on the tape. And that happened not 9 years ago, which is a long time ago, but not that long ago. How is it that that happens? How is it that a Tamir Rice, who's a 12-year-old boy, is seen as a threat because he's in a park with a toy gun, but when the Boogaloo Boys are down in Virginia at UVA, AR-15s, or when they go to the Michigan State House with loaded assault weapons, nobody's afraid and none of them get shot. So that's the conversation we have to have, because either 12-year-old Tamir Rice poses more of a threat than several dozen or more armed men with AR-15s, or he doesn't. So these are things that clearly invite a significant conversation, not just about how we're policed, but even beyond that. Going back to West Virginia, the water that you drink in Keystone, West Virginia is poison. It's poison. So you have poor people there, you have a lot of Black people there. It's a dying town because the coal mining company left, and the United States is allowing it to die, as we had Detroit, as we had Flint, Michigan. But just think about the people who live in these areas. And when you drive down the West Side Highway and you come to Riverside Park and you have to put your windows up and hit recirculation because you can't breathe the air there, but it has a wonderful park there, and it's got tennis courts and basketball courts and wonderful place to play sports. Why is it that only that community, that poor community and predominantly minority community, gets that park? I'm quite sure they would have loved to have had that park on the Upper East Side, but I don't think they wanted the sewage treatment plant that came along with it. So you have to look at environmental racism. We have to look at inequities in terms of our environment, our ability to earn a wage, our ability to go about our daily lives without being stopped for no reason by the police. And I take my hat off to the New York Civil Liberties Union. And I happen to be a board member. I'm now a member of the New York State Board for the Civil Liberties Union. But well before that, when you look at the study that they had done on stop and frisk and how comprehensive it was, and the fact that it showed that such a tremendously disproportionate number of people who stopped were Black and brown, and that more than 90% of those people were found to have not engaged in any wrongdoing. So those of us who think that that's okay, be prepared to get stopped and to have your son or daughter come home and tell you that, hey, they stopped me and they put my skirt around my knees and I was there half naked in the middle of the street, but they didn't arrest me, so it's okay. Or I got pulled over and my coworkers drove by and saw me up against the car, but I didn't get arrested, so it's okay. Or I got detained and I spent a few days in jail, while they figured it out, but they didn't charge me, so it's okay. So a conversation I recently had with Phil Banks, who was the chief of police from the NYPD, was eye-opening. And Phil said that at one point, I believe he was a captain speaking to another captain who was white. And that captain told Phil, 83% of our checkpoints are in minority neighborhoods. Well, if 83% of the checkpoints are there, who do you expect to stop? Who do you expect is going to get the traffic ticket? Who do you think is going to maybe lose their license if they get more than one ticket as the tickets start to accumulate? Who maybe gets stopped because there's marijuana? Maybe they were drinking, and that's not to say that you should be drinking or using marijuana. However, that happens elsewhere, certainly happens in wealthy communities, but the checkpoint's not there. So if the checkpoint's not in the affluent community, you're not going to have those kids get stopped. So it's not going to derail their ability to go to get a good job, whether it's a civil service job right out of high school, or whether they want to go to college, or maybe they want to hold a license. They want to be a licensed electrician, licensed plumber, registered nurse, maybe doctor, lawyer. It's not going to prevent them from doing that. It's not going to make them lose their job as an NFL football player because now you know that they had marijuana. So when you look at the systemic intergenerational impact of all of this, and the toll is in the trillions of dollars, it's crippling. And it prevents people from otherwise being successful. That on top of Tulsa, Rosewood, Greenwood, all of the things that Ken talked about, gives an honest assessment of why we have the conditions that we have. Now, that's not an excuse for me as an individual if I go out and do something. Yeah, I still have to be accountable, but so do the people who police me. They have to be accountable as well. And it's not enough for me to simply say that we need jobs and fish kills, so let's warehouse, people who happen to be black and brown. You can look right now by zip code and determine the likelihood of someone going to prison. There are actuaries that can tell you your percentage, the chances of you getting killed, number one, before you even get to go to prison, and the chances of you going to jail. And you can look at other zip codes and look at the percentage, the chance of you going to an Ivy League institution and being successful and earning seven figures or more in your life. And it has nothing to do with those two individual people. You could take the same child and put that person in the different zip codes, and they would be more likely to have a life dictated by the zip code than based upon who they happen to be. Looking at schools. And it's very interesting right now for me during COVID, because with my kids, they're learning virtually. It makes me wonder, why do we have good schools and why do we have bad schools? Why do certain parts of town have a greater property value than others? Within the same town, why is there an award-winning school and a school that people don't want to send their kids to? And why are we even doing any of this? Because virtually, if I wanted my children to learn physics, they ought to be able to do that from Stephen Hawking. He's the best. He's better than all these school teachers are. Why don't we simply teach that way? So if you look at the potential right now, for every single one of us, irrespective of color, to rise, it's tremendous. It's tremendous. So I want to just focus on the systemic things that exist, how, if we decide to stand up for one another, we can be successful. And that means that when our Chinese brothers and sisters, and more often than not, probably our non-Chinese Asian brothers and sisters that somebody thinks is Chinese, are confronted and blamed for the COVID-19, that we stand with them. And equally as we see George Floyd's and Kenneth Chamberlain's and Tamir Rice's of the world, that our Asian brothers and sisters stand with us, and that along with every other member of our community. Because when we realize and we stand together, then there's very little that we can't achieve. And if you look at the cost of incarceration versus the cost of educating someone, it's tremendous. It's unimaginable. When you look at the fact that we will spend $6,200 per month per individual to be in a homeless shelter, as opposed to putting that person in an apartment that he or she can have to themselves, and that we won't pay for basic health care, and we're told that there's no money, but yet during the first 3 months of this pandemic, nearly $10 trillion magically materializes, and that we don't know where that money really went, then there's money for the things that are important for everybody else as well. And maybe we needed to do that, but certainly there ought to be educational opportunities. There ought to be certainly career opportunities. We should be rebuilding our bridges, our roads. We ought to have jobs that you can live off of. And we should have an adequate education. We shouldn't simply have kids sit in class for 12 years only to find out that they're unemployable because they didn't learn anything that was going to allow them to have a real job. I will leave you with just a few other observations. There was a cross burned in Westchester County. I forget the exact year, but it was maybe 15 years ago. And it was on the home of a really wonderful lady. I'm not going to mention her name. She's since passed away, but a phenomenal, beautiful person. And it was because some kids in northern Westchester didn't like her son. So they came to the house and burned a cross. Things like that happen all the time. And it's not limited to some other community. And I forget which one of my fellow panelists mentioned it, but it's always easier for me to talk about George Zimmerman or to talk about something that's happening outside of where I am. The difficult conversations happen when we're talking about us. And if we have those conversations, there's very little, again, that we can't accomplish because we're building honest relationships. So I can talk to Chris McNerney, who was the chief of police in Greenburgh, and have an honest conversation with him about body cameras and about trying to get funding for that. And Chris came back to me and said, you know what, I'll go talk to Paul Feiner and see if we can get the funding for that. And went to Paul Feiner and the town board, Ken, and we were able to get those body cameras. And what a beautiful thing it was, because the body cameras help the police when the police have done the right thing. They help the client if the police haven't. And sometimes when everybody's coming at it from good faith, it helps us to see where both parties were mistaken. But it gives us an opportunity to really see what did happen. So I look at all of this as a search for the truth, an opportunity to build bridges. It's not to the exclusion of anyone else's suffering. And Tejas and I have had many conversations where we never look at it as a competition to see who has suffered the most. Once you start to do that, then we're wasting our time. But it gives us an opportunity, and this is our starting point on many conversations we plan to have down the road, to look at what has happened in the past, how do we reconcile that, how do we build a bridge going forward, so that 100 years from now, when they've mastered something better than WebEx, that they'll be able to sit down and say, you know, ancestors had a lot of issues, but they came together, they showed the courage, they had a thick enough skin to have an honest conversation and to move into some transition that leaves us with this wonderful world we have right now. So again, I thank you all for taking the time to be here with us. And I look forward to us talking further about any questions or comments that may be that you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayo. Thank you to all four of you. It was, you had very moving words. You shared incredibly personal stories, and Ken gave us a history lesson. And before we talk about some of the questions, we've gotten a number of questions in the chat and prior to the event. I want to give the majority leader a chance. She went first, and if she wants to comment about any of the speakers that went after her and talk about any of the points that were raised that came up afterwards.
Tejas, listening to everything that was said by the other panelists, being Black in America, and I think maybe, Ken said it, all of us have had some of those have been impacted by those experiences. Every single one of us, we don't know necessarily the history of all of us, but the history of the trauma and the denial and the sublimation of what we know are the microaggressions or the macroaggressions were part of our daily life. And still we rise. And I think if we come across anything less than being grateful and honoring our ancestors and those who had, never had the opportunities, not acknowledge them, it would be a shame. So I do that. But I can only say that when he was talking about him not knowing about the desegregation of his school and why he was being bused, that is a reality here in Yonkers. Again, like I said, it started my political career. I talk about it all the time, but nobody in Yonkers is learning about why they're riding on buses or what the history of the school system was. And the desegregation case was ended around the same time that the Human Rights Commission was created. We understand that the Human Rights Commission is created for a reason, as impactful, but people who are in schools now being bused there have no idea why. And so we continue to repeat the same patterns of pretending that nobody's doing anything. I think Shawn may have mentioned, and Mayo, all of them extraordinary, because if you're not forced to pay attention to it, it's not happening to you. So it's easier to believe that it's not happening, especially when it's an inconvenient truth. And so when you talk about things like affirmative action, which was one of the reasons I was able to get a promotion in the Bell system when I was there, it was because people had to sue. My father worked in the Bell system and he worked in the basement. And when you talk about people coming from other countries, you could come from any country in the world and be my father's boss because he was Black in America and he was working in a corporation that disrespected who he was because of the color of his skin. No matter where you came from Europe, you were going to be my dad's boss, period. So I think the conversation here, and I'm sure, we probably went a lot longer, but I think it's important that people have some context because this conversation is not enough. The work that we're all going to have to do is going to have to be sustained, and we're going to need allies. And that's why it was important to have the allies conversation because, we've been going through this a lot. If our allies who are not Black decide that they don't want to pay attention anymore or, make up some new laws that will, roll back the hands of time because the system works like that and majorities rule, they could do that. I doubt, but there is a reality. Who's in these positions matter. Elections matter. Education matters. Allies matter. A sustained interest in justice matters, and that's why this conversation is important. So I thank all of the panelists for presenting and putting so much of your personal experiences out there so that people understand that, despite the trauma, despite the drama, still we rise. Just think if we hadn't had the limited opportunities where so many of us could be.
Thank you, Majority Leader. You remind me of the quote that talks about justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are.
Exactly.
Now, we don't have much time. We've gone long today, but I do want to ask one question to the panel that has come up in the chat. A number of people asked it when I've come into conversations, and I'll throw it out to the panel, is how do you get through to an adult who is in denial that racism exists? I think the programs like this are so important for people to understand, acknowledge racism, but how do you have conversations with people who as the mayor talked about, says you're exaggerating, this is hyperbole? How do you move the needle forward in those situations? Who wants to handle that?
So you can only have a conversation with someone who's interested in learning. If they're in complete denial, if they don't really want to move the needle forward and they want to hold on to whatever their beliefs are, then sometimes you have to let them, because it's not my job to educate people who don't want to be educated. It's not my job to help people understand my struggle if they really just don't want to. I am here to have conversations with anyone who really wants to gain an understanding and have a hard conversation. But if you just believe that we're crying and we're whining and we're entitled, then there's really not much that I can do. And I have enough frustrations in life without trying to convince someone that the world is not flat, and that it's round, and that racism does exist when they absolutely want to believe that it doesn't. So there are some conversations that you spend a lot of energy on if people are interested, and there are some times where you have to let people sit in their ignorance and go on for the rest of their life being ignorant because it is their right.
Thank you, Mayor. One last question. Before we turn it over to Reverend Dr. Stephen Pogue for closing remarks. And this is a question that's also come up repeatedly, and I believe the Majority Leader, quite frankly, I believe all four of you would have thoughts on. Talk about your conversations that you've had with your kids about race. I know in conversations with Mayo, he's had conversations about conversations with his children that maybe white parents don't have. And not everybody knows that. And not everybody understands it because they may not see it. Does somebody want to just talk briefly about that?
I'd be happy to. And if I can, I just want to respond to the last question. I think that one of the things we can do to be effective with people who don't believe that there's any race is to educate ourselves fully. So if we're able to educate ourselves, and if I'm able to show somebody a deed that says that Black people can't buy this house, if the person's still in denial that racism exists, then there's not much more you can do. But you have to meet people who are willing to have a conversation. We have to listen, because we have to be willing to have a conversation, and you have to be able to agree to disagree. With respect to my kids, look, I tell my children all the time, I try to prepare them for how to interact with law enforcement, that if you are going to go jogging, that I want you to be aware of your circumstances, be aware that somebody may think that because you have a sweatsuit on and you're jogging in our town, that could lead to your death. And it's not a conversation I should have to have with them, but I have to have that conversation. I also have to be aware of that myself. I also tell them that the things that you despise in others are things you should not include in yourself. You do not want to be the thing that you don't like. You do not want to treat people in a hateful way. You do not want to be disrespectful of other people. You do not want to make them feel smaller than or alone. And I can tell you that I'm very pleased with my kids, that I think that from what I can see, they are allies, that if they see someone who needs a friend, that they try to befriend that person. They try to stand with people who need someone to stand with them, but also to stand up for yourself, and to understand that because someone makes the suggestion that you are less, that you don't have to accept that we are here for you, that you have a community, that you have people who can stand with you, and that you do not have to accept racism or discrimination in any form, any place. So again, I want them to be able to understand where they are in the community, not to feel less than anybody, but also you do have to be aware of your surrounding circumstances, and the fact that what your friends might be able to do, you probably cannot do.
Okay, thank you. So, you know, I think it's been fascinating to hear from all four of you today. And it just shows and underscores, I think we could talk for much longer, and the need for more of these conversations. This is just the first, and we'll be having these. And I was heartened by seeing how many people registered and signed up and logged on today. I'm going to turn it over now to Reverend Dr. Stephen Pogue. He is the Vice Chair of the Human Rights Commission, and he's going to provide some closing remarks today.
Thank you, Tejas, and thank you to all of our panelists. This was an extremely fascinating conversation, and I'll echo what everyone else has said. It's a conversation that needed to happen, a conversation, some of the tough conversations that we needed to happen. So we thank our majority leader, Andrea Stewart-Cousins, for leading us through the legislation piece, and how she led the Senate to pass legislation about the acts of violence coming from police. And so we thank her for that. And we thank Ken Jones, who did an excellent history lesson on the footprints of African American history and racism in the United States, and that he challenged us not to be politically correct in our silence, but that we have these conversations. And Shawn Patterson Howard, the mayor of this great city of Mount Vernon, we thank her for leading us through that discussion on allies, that we need allies that would listen for understanding and would sit down with us, and not just stand for us, but stand with us in the midst of it all. And we thank Mayo Bartlett for his conversation on truth and reconciliation, and having real open and honest conversations that will lead to success throughout the iniquities that happen in our community. So we're just grateful for a power-packed panelists who have really led us through this discussion on race and the path forward. And so on behalf of the Human Rights Commission, we thank you very much for being with us. We thank our Executive Director, Tejas Sanchala, for this idea, and that this is not the last one that we'll have, but there are many more conversations about race throughout this panel and other panels that we'll have, that will continue to talk about the healing that needs to happen, and reconciliation that'll come through the truth. as we have these hard and difficult conversations. Once again, to anyone who's listening, if you have seen or know of if you've experienced hate crimes or hate incidences, the Westchester Human Rights Commission is here for you. You can report it to us, whether it's discrimination in housing, employment, or anywhere else. The Human Rights Commission is here for you. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. And thank you, panelists, for an incredible discussion on race and the path forward.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much. Until we meet again and until our next conversation, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Tejas.
Thank you.
All right.